Productivity and profit in markets, Econ 3.3. Every market structure has a different level of productivity and therefore a different level of profit. So in this video, we will discover the different productivities and profits of the different market structures. But first, some terms. Productivity is the level of output or amount of product that results from a given level of input using your resources. So your productivity is determined by how many products you can make with a specific set of resources. Therefore, your profit is determined by the difference between the revenue, that's the money that your product was sold for, and the cost, the money required to make the product. So when we subtract cost from revenue, we get profit, how much money you get to keep. In factoring in productivity and profit, you have to think about how long your production schedule really is. In the long run is considered a time period where everything, all inputs and outputs, can be changed. So you can change the number of resources, the number of products you make, etc. In the short run is considered a time period where at least one input or one resource cannot be changed. An example of short run production would be a dairy during the holiday season. They only make eggnog once a year. So in the short run, they need to make a lot of eggnog, but they might not have enough resources, such as the size of their factory space, which factory is a resource, in order to produce enough eggnog. So there's no specific time period or time constraints between long run or short run. However, there is a clear difference when everything can be changed versus at least one thing cannot be changed. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's take a look at productivity and profit in a perfectly competitive market. Perfect competition is dictated by what we call the invisible hand. The invisible hand of the market is Adam Smith, a famous economist. It's his assumption that markets are perfectly competitive. As we saw in the supply and demand unit, Unit 2, markets are perfectly competitive, where price is determined, where buyers and sellers are both happy or comfortable with the supply and the demand for that product. So therefore, price is determined at the X, where supply and demand meet. So the price of carrots and the price of apples is determined at the X, where the supply and the demand meet. So this is price. In a perfectly competitive market, remember that profit is almost zero. Because there are so many producers, nobody controls enough of the market to control the price. Therefore, in the long run, where all productivity can be changed, in the long run average cost, so that's what LRAC stands for, long run average cost. In the long run, the cost of the product is going to be the same. Price will equal cost in a perfectly competitive market. So yes, in a perfectly competitive market, profit is near zero. There's a difference between economic costs and normal costs, but we won't get too specific into that. So let's imagine that for a moment that society is happy with producing both carrots and apples. But let's say that suddenly society begins valuing apples over carrots. What is going to happen to our demand curve? Our demand will increase. Now, assuming that society can only produce two products, apples and carrots, if they're producing more apples, or demanding more apples, what happens to the demand for carrots? Naturally, the demand for carrots will go down. So therefore, as the demand of apples has gone up, so will the supply of apples. And since society produces only two goods, if they're supplying more apples, the supply of apples has gone up, they have to supply fewer carrots. So therefore, in a perfectly competitive market, in the perfectly competitive market for carrots and apples, all we've done is shown an increase in demand and therefore an increase in supply of apples and a decrease in supply and a decrease in demand for carrots. Why is that? Because due to the profits and losses in each, remember there was a loss in carrots when the demand went down. When the demand went down, the demand was below long-run average cost. Therefore, sellers would exit the market for carrots and enter the market for apples because more people are now demanding apples. Prices will return to the long-run average cost, and the only thing that's really changed is the quantity of what we're producing. Because previous to this demand shift, we had a price and a quantity of carrots at this level, and a price and a quantity of apples at this level. Now, since society has changed their value of carrots versus apples, we maintain the same price, but we have a lower quantity of carrots, it's closer to 0, and we have a higher quantity of apples. So how do we show that on our production possibilities graph? Remember those back from Unit 1. We have carrots. Society can produce carrots, and society can produce apples. So we'll just make up some numbers, whereas before the demand for apples changed, we had an allocation of apples to carrots here. Well, all we've done is produced less carrots now that the demand for apples has gone up, so fewer carrots and more apples. We're still staying on the production possibilities curve, we're just changing the amount. So this is still allocatively efficient, which means that resources are reallocated to meet the needs of the consumers. How does this all work? So will supply and demand set the price. No firm has enough share of the market to set the price, and each firm sets a price level of output that will maximize its profit at that price. Therefore, the long-run profit is 0. In a perfectly competitive market, there's very little incentive to stay in that market or to keep your product the same because profitability is so low. So firms begin to compete on non-price competition. Non-price competition such as location or service or brand characteristics or advertising, etc. So location, service, etc. Sorry for my little chicken scratch there. So let's graph this. All that the firm tries to do is they try to increase the demand to earn profits. So if the average price, if the long-run average cost is here, where the supply and demand meet, how do monopolistically competitive firms earn a profit? Well, what they do is they try to drive up demand by differentiating their product. So for example, water is water, but when they put it in a nice square bottle, like Fiji has done, it drives up demand or increases demand for their product. Now, if this is price, this is the original price right here, now that they have driven up demand for their product, they get a new price here and a new quantity. So what they've done is they've driven up price and they've driven up quantity demanded. Therefore, they're going to start to earn a profit. The difference between the long-run average cost, the point where it costs them to make the product, and the current price, this little gap here, is their profit. Their profit tends to be low, however, there still is a profit, and that's why they advertise so heavily to try to gain more profit. Productivity and profit in a monopoly works very similar to that of monopolistic competition, however, it tends to be a little bit higher. So let's imagine again that this represents the point of long-run average cost. That's the long-run average cost for the firm to produce the product. Well, what the firm will do in an oligopolistic market structure, so where 2, 3, or 4 firms control most of the market, is they will attempt to also drive up demand by competing on different factors like non-price competition, but also they'll try to compete on price itself. So let's say that they drive up demand additionally further because there's only a few suppliers, so they'll drive up demand more than in a perfectly competitive market. So here we see a bigger gap representing a bigger profit. However, what oligopolistic firms can also do, because there's a few suppliers, they can also reduce the supply. If they reduce the supply, then we get an even higher price. So price went originally from this point all the way up to this point. So we see an increase in price by simply decreasing supply to try to drive up demand for their product. And finally, we have a monopoly. So in a monopoly, there's a perfectly elastic curve for the demand of a product in a monopoly. So here we see the demand. However, a monopolist controls the supply of a product. So if, for example, the monopolist decides to keep the supply very, very low, they can have a significant impact on the market. So let's imagine that the monopolist wants to keep supply low to try to drive up demand for its product. So let's say that the supply line, which is still an upward sloping line, is here. Price of the product is going to exist in this location here where supply and demand meet. However, a monopolist will control the supply, and therefore they'll use what we call marginal revenue, which is revenue based on the change that one additional product out on the market makes in order to determine price. And they will choose a profit maximizing price. So if the monopolist wants to drive up price to the absolutely highest point that they can while still having demand for their product, they will choose a point, perhaps, that is way up here. So they will restrict supply in order to drive up price. So price was about $32, and now price will be about $45. So they've driven up price, and they've controlled the supply. The long-run profit is high because a monopolist can move the supply line, the black line, wherever it so chooses. They can move it in a variety of ways. They could move it very close if they were trying to earn more profit, or less profit if they were trying to do a little bit public relations push, or if they knew that their product was so wanted, such as the diamond industry, that they would restrict supply enough to where the price, where the demand and supply line meet, where the price was so high that very few buyers could actually purchase the product. Which market structure is most efficient? Well, perfect competition. However, perfect competition doesn't exist long in the world because everyone is concerned with profit. Profitability drives production, which also drives price, quantity demanded, and a number of other things. So in studying market structures, we have to understand that buyers and sellers interact. However, there is a lot that goes into it aside from market structure because productivity and profit factors in to the firm's decision to supply their product. Next up, side effects of markets.